We couldn't impose wrong on anybody. We had, in fact, to assert the rightness of our cause and the righteousness of our cause, and be willing to suffer and sacrifice to that end. And nonviolence was both a strategy and a way of life. If we had been fighting with arms, we couldn't have battled in arms.
Can we start with just telling us, how did you first meet Dr. King and what were your first impressions?
Well, I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, and most of our people had adjusted to this situation. Ministers reinforced the adjustment. Be good people, but don't fight for change, don't fight for power, because it met with such stiff resistance. So to see Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and Reverend Shuttlesworth emerge as redefining the role of ministers was itself a source of relief. So we met them there. We began to follow them in that vein. I was arrested July 1960 with several classmates trying to use a public library. Little did I know he was aware of that. And then in '63 in Greensboro, North Carolina, at North Carolina A&T, we were involved in a major sit-in movement there. So when I first met him physically, I was coming to Atlanta to speak at Morehouse as a member of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. And he was coming to the airport with his group only to get his Nobel Prize. It was just a thrill to see him. He saw me, he called my name, Jesse. It threw me off. Hi, it's Sam. He was talking about Dr. Sam Proctor, who he knew at Boston University, and they were good friends. He began how things going in Greensboro, how things at A&T, how things at Bennett. So the fact that he was, because we had been on television quite a bit during that time, during the Greensboro struggle. So I met him in that sense. To me, it depicted how sensitive he was, how aware he was of our struggle. I remember Ernie Green talking about when they graduated from Little Rock Central, he was at the graduation. Not as a speaker, he was just there at the graduation. He was deeply immersed in the Southern struggle to end apartheid in the South. I remember the first time I was real close. We were in Selma, and Reverend C.T. Vivian and I went by Miss Boynton's house where he was staying. He was lying in bed. He had by him Love, Power, and Justice by Paul Tillich, The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich, Nature and Destiny of Man by Niebuhr, and the Bible. I asked him about the books because I was in seminary at the time. He said, well, I read one fiction, one nonfiction book a week. He was deeply scholarly. As I often say to young people who catch on to I have their dream dimension of his life, Dr. King finished high school at 15. He finished Morehouse at 19. He finished seminary at 22, his PhD at 26. Deeply committed to scholarship. He knew the strong minds break strong chains. I always hear young people say, now, when did he become radical? To be in Montgomery, Alabama, a block from the Confederate Capitol and from the Confederate White House, and to call a boycott to dislocate that city in the South was a very radical move.
As you got to know him personally, what surprised you about him as a person?
His energy level and his reading habits and his willingness to open up to other people, to staff members, and to let ideas flow. Will you agree with him or disagree? Or something he would just point blank, what do you see? His willingness to a kind of participatory democracy. He had a point of view, he had a conclusion, but that feature of him and his preparation, he usually spent Tuesday was kind of his off day. He spent Tuesday studying, reflecting upon what happened the last week and projecting. But he was quite sociable. I mean, he laughed a lot, with friends. What we call preacher jokes. So he was once a very personable guy. Many activists don't have much analysis. Many analysts don't have much action. He had the combination of action and analysis and preparation. He would say you must not have the paralysis of analysis. You can't just keep on talking. You have to act. But if you act without analysis, you don't know where you're going. And if you see it but you don't act, you can't get there. So he saw the combination that led to power, and that power led to change.
He refers to his staff as a team of wild horses. There are a lot of strong personalities there. Can you talk about that?
We would have the right to argue and take positions. And he would say two things. One, that we were a team of wild horses, and it was his job to take that energy and direct it. And sometime when the stuff would get hot on the inside of the staff, and he would say, well, we reflect in here what's out there. We cannot corral ourselves. We cannot corral the community. And so he saw that in some perspective. The other thing he would say that he was the pilot of the plane, but we were the ground crew. Without the ground crew, the plane cannot go from port to port, from arrival to departure. It cannot have the mechanical dimensions. So he had an appreciation of the field crew, and he saw himself as kind of guiding those forces. And he was more interested in building a kind of a tugboat as opposed to an ocean liner. He didn't want a big organization per se. He didn't want a membership organization, so he could get bogged down and raise members. It was not the big ocean liner. He wanted to have a strike force that go into a given time and raise the issues, expose the contradictions, and had the courage to fight. I remember him telling me one time that he did not want to build a big building and leave it as a monument, or didn't want to have a lot of money left. He felt that if any money were left, it would be a reflection on his leadership, that it was not about money. He believed that you should be materialistically minded enough to take care of basic essentials, but not mindless and materialistic and out for your stuff. He had that sense of his value. That's why when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he gave money away to all other organizations, kept just a proportion for SCLC, because those were kind of his values.
How did the movement change when it moved up here to Chicago and your role in that?
Two things happened in Chicago. One thing happened was that the Fair Housing Act of '68 became the Chicago Open Housing Movement. That's as concrete as the public accommodation of the right to vote, to fair housing. The second was Rainbow Push, which here at Dr. King's workshop. We never stopped. Dr. King had said this would not be a 3-month, 6-month movement like a kind of one-horse, small southern town. This is a big, complex Chicago. Out of Chicago has come 4 black congressmen, 3 U.S. senators, state black African-American senators. I ran for president, Barack won for president, all that stuff, because we helped to lead the breakup of the mentally incarcerated blacks in this city and unleash that power.
Going back to in Chicago, King talks about how surprised he was at the ferocity of the whites.
Chicago is a city of ethnic enclaves, 70-some cities within the city. And people fiercely guard their neighborhood turf. And diverse ethnic groups, European ethnic groups, have certain territories. There's Latinos and blacks and Russians and Germans and all that. So we started marching west of Halsted. They started invading their territory. And they had seen blacks in the most stereotypical terms. When we come, pain comes, community disintegration comes, and there was a reaction to us as a people, stereotypes. And so we began to march for the right of open housing. And we would have a black and a white go to rent a house. They would tell the black no rooms available, white come right back and get room available. So we had to break down house by house. And then they had the real estate guys, they what they call block busting. Once a black moved in on the block, till other whites, they're coming and they jack the price. So it really was not just the crowd throwing the rocks, which is obvious. The real estate brokers were behind that deal, and the bankers. Bankers would only lend you money to buy a house or for business in certain areas. So the bankers had a role in this. Their hands were hid. The real estate brokers leading the blockbuster, and they had a role to play in this. So the kids throwing rocks, they may be in the 3rd or 4th layer resistance.
What about King when he moved in with his family to the projects?
Yeah, on the west side, he moved into just to prove, when he moved into that apartment, it was to put a focus on the fact that people had to pay rent, didn't have heat, had to pay rent, maybe didn't have running water, had to pay rent, lead paint on the walls. I mean, and so by moving in the middle of the community, it put a global focus. In other words, he had the strategic sense to put light in dark places and heat in cold places. He knew that by his corner, it illuminated the situation. You could say, oh man. He would say the most difficult part of a movement when you leave the excitement of a march in Selma, where there's even violent reaction. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is that when all that's over, you got to get people to register and vote. They call the slow, non-romantic dimension, when the lights are not there. The hard, cold, organized, convincing people to change their minds, to change their situation. Because at the end of the day, change comes when people change their minds. Most people who are under occupation, whose backs are against the wall, have three options. And that's why it's so difficult to organize without understanding this. Most people are just. They've found their place, they've found their space, where they live, where they can live, where they grocery shop, where they go to school, where they go to church, where they get married. They live in the circle, and they've adjusted to, they blank the outside world away. So if you're in the ghetto, now you're paying pension funds, and the pension funds are building the other side of town. They're building the big, tall buildings, but you just forget that. You're living in conditions where you live there, but you don't control the economic resources, but you've adjusted. And some people, beyond, they know better, but they don't feel empowered enough to change anything. So they often become very bitter. They're not adjusted, they resent. And then there's the third dimension called resistance. That's where the action comes in, where where you become maladjusted, as Dr. King would say. And you resent, but you also begin to resist. Resisting means some kind of boycott, some kind of action. The weapons we use, the effective use of one's vote, one's dollar, coalition, action, and to be morally right. Those are the weapons that you use. Because at the end of the day, our biggest weapon is to be mostly morally right. Mrs. Parks was mostly right. Those who marched in Birmingham were mostly right. Those who marched for the right to vote were mostly morally right. We couldn't impose wrong on anybody. We had, in fact, to assert the rightness of our cause and the righteousness of our cause, and be willing to suffer and sacrifice to that end. And nonviolence is both a strategy and a way of life. If we had been fighting with arms, we couldn't have battled in arms. But then Dr. King said, if you shoot and you get shot, then there are no winners. But if you can have change without shooting and getting shot, then both can survive for another day.
You've already talked about the assassination. You went home to Chicago right afterwards. Could you talk about the rioting?
I woke up the next morning. Chuck Purser was standing over me, sent the Purser to come by the house. I was still laying with my clothes on. I went down to City Hall. I was so angry. Because the same force that was so hostile toward him, some of the ministers and political leaders, the data forces that say he should get out of town, he had no place in Chicago. They were having the drapes, the purple and black drapes, and I was mad as hell. So you guys sit here as hypocrites. I was trying to control my anguish with discipline. It was hard to do, and I left that afternoon and went on back to Atlanta, but I came home first. But there were explosions all over the country. We were trying to turn garbage into energy if you can discipline it. So our point was, don't just burn up where you live. There's some of the areas that were burned out are still burned out. these many years later. Turn your anger into votes. You should turn your anger into boycotts. Turn your anger into opening school doors that are closed. Because if you spend more than you have, you get in debt, you vote less than you have, that's a formula for suicide. If you spend less than you have and vote all you can, that's a formula for power. This is Chicago. This is not Selma or Birmingham or Atlanta. This is Chicago. And so we had to figure our way out how to navigate through this urban situation and build coalitions. That's why I say that the weapons are, you have to have the right to vote. You have to right use of your dollars, build coalitions, act and be most morally right. All that stuff has to come together to make something happen. But Dr. King warned us of this. He said, you'll have these forward movements forward, and then fear will set in, and then reaction will set in. You plant two seeds in the ground of equal strength, and you water them both. Would you put a wall between them? One will grow tall with multiples of fruit, and one will be short and stunted. It does not mean the smaller is less than, the other is more than. It's something called photosynthesis. One that had the light could flourish. And whites often have the light, and they flourish, not because they're better, because they have photosynthesis. Or to put it another way, you have a wall between you, and on the other side of the wall is ignorance, fear, hatred, and violence. So you pull the walls and we can see each other. We become teammates on the football field. We become teammates in the army. We must become teammates in voting for health care, in jobs and justice. That's what I do. That's why we choose bridges over walls.
You talked about that meeting when he called you back into Memphis. Go back a little bit to like how King and you, and as the staff reacted to the violence of the first march.
Dr. King, there's another case why violence does not work, because violence sucks the oxygen out the tank. The focus on how accurate or inaccurate the rocks were, but not focus on garbage workers and collective bargaining. And so, but we knew that was a plan to get attention by them. And it could have been even paid provocateurs, we were not sure. But we took that, so Dr. King can't control his troops. It's not true. The ministers and the garbage workers were marching lockstep with Dr. King. The rock throwers were coming from another angle. So the whole thing about putting it, he can't control his troops. The fact is, our troops were growing, and our sense of focus was growing. We went back into Memphis again, determined to have another march. And that's what the rally in Mason Temple was the night before. Was all about that. The week before, Dr. King had been in Chicago at the breadbasket meeting. And he'd heard Ben Branch play Precious Lord on the saxophone. He'd never heard that before. It was a beautiful rendition. So I was coming across the courtyard, and Dr. King, he's about an hour late, as he was typically. He said, Jesse, you ready to go? I said, you're done. He said, you don't even have on a tie. So I said, Dr. King, a prerequisite for eating another tie is an appetite. He said, you're crazy. We laughed. And he said to Ben, how you doing? And Ben said, Dr. King, he played my favorite song tonight, Precious Lord, because he'd heard him play it 2 weeks before. And he said, and then he raised up, the bullet hit him right here. It severed his tie. I heard someone, I think Bevel was saying, get low, because whoever was shooting, their spray bullets, could have shot several of us. And I hit running toward the steps. And there's a picture of Andy Young and pointing. The pointing is that he was knocked against the wall, and the police were coming from that way with the guns. We said the shooter came from that way, not this way. That's what that picture was all about. And I remember getting down, and by the time Reverend Abernathy came out the room, he said, Martin, but he was non-responsive. So I got up and went and called Mrs. King, because I was living next door to them. And I called by his bedside. I had that phone. She said, hello, Jesse, how you doing? I said, Miss King, I said, it was a long 10 steps to take from where he was to that phone. Dr. King been shot. I think he'd been shot in the shoulder, but I think you should come. I really couldn't say what I saw. It was like too much to say. It's like, it couldn't say that. Couldn't say that. And she said, I'll come. And maybe a few minutes later, AP called, said he was dead. And that's when a new dimension of our struggle took off.
And what would you say finally to the people that missed that? Who obviously most people are too young to have marched in Selma, to have marched in Chicago. What's the work that we need to do?
Those who live today are those who watch the Sunday football game. They miss the process from Monday to Sunday, the practice, the preparation. There is a new South today, and there's in many ways a new America because Dr. King led the movement to pull down those walls. You could not have the Carolina Panthers and Atlanta Falcons. They couldn't have existed behind the cotton curtain because it would have been illegal for them to play together, stay together, sit in the fans together, in the stands together. You couldn't have had the Olympics in Atlanta behind the cotton curtain. South Carolina would not be the #1 producer of tires in America today behind the cotton curtain. You wouldn't have Honda and Nissan and Toyota in the South behind the cotton curtain today. You couldn't have had Clemson playing Alabama, black quarterbacks in the South behind the cotton curtain. So in many ways, the whole South must attribute its growth and its removal of certain barriers, not to any Southern governor or in the Southern Center. All that was in Dr. King's watch.